you very much for, I would say, bringing me in from afar. Of course, it's a very great pleasure to continue a discussion and a debate, which, as Professor Börsig has pointed out, we started nearly 5 years back with the first double workshop program with our dear friends and colleagues at Fudan, which we then continued in May, and now we're going into the 4th round of G20 related and economic governance related topics. A very special thank you to Sebastian to put my paper on this famous graveyard of papers right after the dinner break. So being a political scientist and not an economist, I traded most of the figures with colorful pictures, hoping that even not only my insights might keep you awake, then at least some colorful pictures might do. As you will see, looking at financial governance in this combination of where did the G20 and global financial governance end up last year at the G20 summit in Hangzhou, where is there a certain degree of continuity now looking at the G20 summit in Hamburg this weekend. There are different contents, some of them are ideas, points of interest I've been developing over a couple of years, some of them very, very new and part of an ongoing research with Kaspari, who deserves a big credit for the better parts of this presentation. And of course, all the mistakes still rest in line with myself. We have discussed this earlier today, that when the G20 in its current form was taking shape in 2008, this was all about financial governance. This was an attempt to find a way to deal with the potentially even more disastrous fallout from a crisis which had just started to become global in December 2008. When we look now at the latest existing documentation, as we all said and discussed earlier this morning, the next summit is coming up by the end of this week, so the meeting of the ministers of finance and the heads of central banks in Baden-Baden, financial governance really had been pushed back, and this is all much more about a complete new global order. I think this is where we will have a certain line between the very first panel and this panel now in sorting out how far are we still discussing really issues of financial governance of the G20 and how has a completely new aspect taken shape. And this is what a global order, a global economic order is looking like today. And one point which time did not allow to discuss earlier today is who actually should still champion global financial governance in a world where the Eurozone crisis might have taken a rest. It's really not over. I think Bernadette just introduced me to some very good figures over lunch, where China's new normal might incorporate fundamental issues about how stable the economy is, how stable its financial system is, how sustainable the political system is that has decided to treat human rights the way it does at the moment. We are still trying to cope with Brexit. Everyone in the world probably has to find a way to understand the American political system as it works at the moment, what does not work at the moment. So clearly, we've been moving in a completely different set of turbulent times, which of course has a fundamental impact on, if we talk about financial governance, which level of governance we're talking about, or are there much more fundamental things at play, much more fundamental dynamics we have to look at. Now looking back to Hangzhou in 2016, and I still can only recommend for everyone who has not spent time in front of CCTV coverage or YouTube or wherever you find these videos on this great show of Chinese global leadership. The first time I read in a Chinese newspaper that this was a show of Xi Jinping's leadership in global economic governance, not China's, Xi Jinping's personal one. So as a propaganda story, I think Hangzhou worked very, very well. If you only spend a few minutes with non-Chinese media, you get the impression it's been two worlds, a big success inside the PRC, a lot of skepticism and negative feedback from international audience who were all asking, well, this is Chinese leadership, where's the beef, where's the substance, where are the outcomes? Which, in the context of this workshop, of course leads to the issue of what roles are there for the strategic, mature, comprehensive partnership between the European Union and China in this area. If China is now offering global advice for how to best deal with issues of financial governance. Where does it lead the partnership between China and the European Union? Already the topic of discussions at the first panel this morning. Now, this of course is an area where people in Bochum have continued with for the last couple of years. I think some of the students already sit through some of those seminars on this issue. There is a long history where Europe and China, as representative of East Asia, have been developing an institutionalized, multi-level, dynamic framework for dealing with all sorts of policy issues. I'm happy to go into more detail with this official chart of the European Union, which is deliberately left in the small font size as taken from EU documentation. It would only distract you for the next half hour trying to make sense of it. The key point is that financial services is part of an ever-growing, multi-level, multi-layer, multi-issue, multi-dimensional framework for cooperation among experts, politicians, people. And if this looks complicated, the official chart of the current architecture of EU-China relations 5 years ago, this is a more current stock taking. And probably there already ought to be 2 or 3 more charts by now. This is taken of February 2017. It's the most recent one I found. I would guess you probably have an even better insight and might add at least half a dozen more policy fields and dialogue fora which have been created, which work in order to allow for at least an exchange of views, getting to know each other, in the best case, for coordinating on joint policy making. And in there, somewhere in the main pillar at the center, financial services, issues of regulation. So there is a history and there's an institutionalized basis for the European Union and China to cooperate at a global level in dealing with issues of financial governance. This institutional setting, trying to sum up these complicated charts, started back in the early 2000s, and my understanding around 2003 with first informal requests by the Chinese side that they would want to start an exchange of views, an exchange of best practices, an exchange of ideas on how to create markets of financial services. What was Europe doing at the time? Chinese reforms were taking off too. So it started very informally and very slow in the 2000s and became a major part of the 3-pillar structure of EU-China strategic partnership, including some high-level, very well-funded projects to bring together all sorts of experts and people to deal with all sorts of risks and technical issues, plus political and social implications regarding financial services. So, technically, the cooperation between the European Union and China on issues of financial governance at a global as well as an inter-regional scale could start at a very solid and very sophisticated basis developed over the last 10+ years. However, trying to understand what happened, what did not happen, for reasons most of the students here know, Sebastian and I started an exercise using your theory, trying to better understand those steps from institutions, ideas exchanged to policies being implemented, being conducted on the ground, modeling them as the EU and China acting according to ideas, to norms, to self-prescriptions, what they consider themselves to be in the global scene, thereby incorporating expectations by others. And so acting within both the framework of bilateral relations and the framework at the global level in trying to push through policies, or what I still find much more striking until today, not pushing for any joint global initiatives in this area of global finance. Of course, I'm more than happy to take more questions on the theoretical perspective later on, but I think this workshop is much more on global economic governance and less on the basic idea of global theory. In enacting policies around financial services and conducting their cooperation in this field, some basic ideas about what Europe's foreign policy should be, what China's foreign policy should be, how they consider themselves, developed over the years. And you have a different set of so-called roles or role concepts on both sides, of course having an effect on how policies are implemented at the level of the G20. The key understanding, from my point, would be that the European Union, with all its deficits, and of course all the academic debate criticizing or supporting this, considers itself and seeks to act as a normative power, as a power who is pushing through certain policies less by means of economic or leave alone military force, but more so by being a role model, by acting according to well-defined norms and principles. One basic idea which served the People's Republic of China's foreign policies over the last 25 years, and I still think can be traced in a lot of documents, although we will talk about it, profound change later on, is the idea of China as an emerging power, as a new style power. I love the term developing country, which was one of the expressions coming up in the first Shanghai workshop. And with all those different ideas about what China should be at the global scene, what Europe should be at the global scene, there was a profound match of roles. Interestingly enough, for most of the early years of the 2000s until around 2009, 2010, official representatives of the People's Republic of China were more than happy to portray themselves, to act as representatives of the nation who want to learn from best global practice, from European experience, who are more than willing to be socialized into the existing framework of global economic and financial governance. And of course, the European Union was more than happy to offer all sorts of advice and role model examples, which, as a critical academic, you start wondering if it was really capable of providing in those years. But nevertheless, those two roles clearly matched, and hence we did see this development from an informal starting point to this well advanced institutional framework. Now moving to more concrete policy fields, and sensing that I will get some issues with my chair with the next 3 to 4 minutes. If you look on how China presented itself in the area of global financial governance about 10 months ago at the Hangzhou summit in September 2016. The idea was to push the G20 to an agenda of innovation, invigorating the global economy as well as most domestic economies, emphasizing the idea of an interconnected and inclusive world economy. As quite a few people have argued otherwise at other places, those ideas are closely linked with key principles and policies out of China's most recent 5-year plan, out of the idea to turn China's own economic policies towards a more innovation and high-tech oriented economy. In this regard, there was an attempt to use the chairmanship of the G20 in 2016 to upload Chinese economic reform ideas to the global level. We haven't, of course, at least officially, the final document of the G20 summit for Hamburg available yet, though we do have reports and a bit of insight into certain preparatory meetings. We do have an official agenda, and at least those ideas of invigorating the interconnected economy have moved on to the German presidency, to shaping the interconnected world, building resilience, improving sustainability, assuming responsibility, which leads to 3 different areas of policy fields to be tackled over the weekend. And already here, you can see that financial markets, international financial architecture, the first and most important reason for the G20 to be put in place 10 years ago, has moved somewhere down the line. There are some links with digitalization. Someone pointed out this morning, of course, finance is very important. I think it was Jiejin for climate and energy. So we would still have links to the more prominent, more urgent issues, but it's really not at the focus of the next couple of days. Rushing through a few policy fields, China was very active, and thereby sticking with its traditional self-described role as a speaker of the developing world, representative of those who were not sitting at the G20 table, voice of the South, in supporting initiatives to make sure that trade-related finance is available for the least development, that development finance is not cut, that the mechanisms to support development are improved, which feeds in very nicely in the idea of the compact with Africa, putting development very much into the focus of the official German agenda for the next couple of days. So here it looks like the partnership around finance seems to be working quite well. One of the most fascinating and theoretically promising areas, I think, would be green finance. So somebody else in the audience probably should take on here and continue on my behalf, because Ulrike Solmecke is working on sustainability and green finance in much more detail. This is one element where finally, after 7 or 8 years of trying to change Chinese policy, that we find one step where there was real leadership in creating something new within the G20 with regard to financial regulation by the People's Republic of China pushing for green finance, making green finance a key element of the G20 agenda, but then failing to move the green finance study group, which is a rather low-level way of discussing a topic at the G20, to a proper green finance working group, which would have increased the impact of the finance on the G20's agenda. But here China pushed an idea, continued to push, and seems to get some support from the German presidency. This is an area where Baden-Baden, the meeting of the ministers of finance, did not produce too many interesting outcomes. It will be very interesting for me as an academic who does not have direct access to the Sherpas and all these preparatory meetings, and how far this is showing up in the final documents of the G20. And then there's one area where, again, Chinese domestic policies now found their way into the official G20 agenda. This is around the digital economy, digitalization, one of the key areas of German-Chinese cooperation, and increasingly important area of EU-Chinese cooperation. And one area where I won't go into too much detail, but again, I'm more than happy to take questions on that afterwards, where China, more or less by coincidence, not by official policies, has become a world leader in all those internet-based financial services and financial instruments, where, well, now Germany has started to understand this might be important, and the EU is starting to develop policies in this direction, so it has to be somewhere in the line, but clearly is not very high up the official agenda of the German government. However, with this, for reasons, for different reasons, including Chinese companies making their inroads into the European Union for technological leadership by huge Chinese companies, it rather looks like for the first time Europe following a model set by the People's Republic of China. If this would take place within the G20, find their way into the G20 policies, we would again have matching roles in this area, and thereby a great likelihood for further institutionalization to take place. I promise. We already had some discussions about institutional reforms. It's still there. It's probably much more about implementation than major new initiatives, which was defined as some of the real issues by a third party, the Financial Stability Board, itself a product of the G20, which in a letter by its chair to the ministers of finance said, all fine what you are discussing guys, but from a financial stability perspective, please make sure that other areas, shadow banking, derivative markets, dealing with new sorts of vulnerabilities are dealt with properly. So here you can see a gap between Chinese and German G20 steersmanship and what the Financial Stability Board set up by the G20 is considering to be the real issues around financial markets which should be dealt with. This gets me to my two concluding slides. So, looking at how roles are changing, have been changing in between the EU and China in the context of the G20, there's of course all those issues of the known and unknown risks and insecurities regarding Europe and China as global actors, which of course will have an effect on their capacity to deal with technical issues of global economic governance. depending on how Brexit plays out, the European Union might get out of it much stronger. I think that was the optimistic view introduced by Shahid Islam this morning, but with the caution that this might be a short-term observation. On the other hand, it might actually mean the end of the EU as we know it, and thereby the end of all the slides I produced. On the other hand, on 25th April of this year, the highest party organ of the People's Republic of China, the Communist Party of China, had a study session on financial security. Because both with regard to domestic developments and the effects global developments might have on China's economic political system seem to have reached a point that the top leadership wanted to be informed and wanted to discuss it in detail. And it was, according to Chinese sources, the very first time that financial issues, financial security was made a topic for one of these study sessions, which have been reintroduced at a much more regular basis under Xi Jinping's leadership. And it was the only time where not foreign experts or domestic experts were invited to discuss, but the top representatives of all those state organs who, at least theoretically, should deal with issues of financial stability, thereby highlighting that it's not just strange Western observers who think there might be some weaknesses and deficits in China's financial system, but this has become a concern at the very highest level of Chinese policymaking. Now, this leads me to a slightly or clearly less optimistic perception of and how far the strategic partnership might play a role in financial governance as part of the G20, as part of future cooperation in global economic governance. We are just witnessing both a remarkable change in the overall framework for cooperation. I think Sebastian called it the two T's, transatlantic relations and Trump, all the issues around the Eurozone, all the issues about stability and the politics or non-politics of the next few months until the next Chinese leadership is put into place, not to say thrown. When these developments of cooperation started, roads matched very well, and we witness a dramatic increase in institutionalization and density of cooperation. Now, when there's a real need for alternative leadership, which country, which government is in a position, has the capacity and the political will in the G20 and is not facing major domestic crises at the moment to provide leadership in the G20? We just have a quick run from the United States to the BRICS countries to Europe. Most governments have definitely very pressing tasks which have nothing to do with global economic governance. So, at a time when there would be a huge leadership void, roads might not be matching, the partnership might not be working in the sense to fill this leadership gap. In this regard, the Trump factor shows that there's a very bad timing for, positively speaking, very dynamic new developments in EU-China relations, or the inability to come up with solutions to issues which have been debated in the last couple of years. Plus, it's probably really more about the fundamental understanding that we want to have, the rule-based global order, and the Xi Jinping's free trade, anywhere near free trade defined by other people, than all those regulatory issues on the agenda of the Financial Stability Board or ivory tower academics like us. Thank you very much.